My name is Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture series and introduce our speaker today. The speaker, Dr. Lucila Polo. She's currently an honorary fellow in LASIS here at UW-Madison. She has a PhD and a bachelor's in Latin American Studies from the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City. Dr. Polo, he's an author and editor on political violence, autonomy, territory, and rights of indigenous peoples. She has taught at the National University in Mexico and has worked as a human rights educator and activist in Chiapas. She was advisor and deputy director of studies at the National Council to Prevent Discrimination, and also worked as an analyst and researcher at the Human Rights Commission of the Federal District in Mexico. Dr. Polo is going to talk to us about her research with the Tohono Oodham Nation in Mexico. Please allow me to welcome Dr. Polo. Go ahead, Lucila.
Thanks to Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program for this opportunity to share in my research that I'm conducting during my fellowship at the UW-Madison. Briefly, I want to mention why I am interested in the Tohono Oodham Nation now. During my professional performance, I have analyzed various problems of indigenous peoples, such as violence, political violence, race and ethnicity, and self-determination and autonomy experiences in Latin America. But delving more deeply in these issues, it led me to what I consider the root of the indigenous problem. Sorry, the territorial dispossession. Let me share my So the territorial dispossession signified many things for, hold on a second, I'm sharing my, I'm gonna share now my screen. There you go. Sorry about that. So delving, as I was saying, delving more deeply into the problems of the indigenous people, it led me to consider the root of their problems. In my opinion, territorial dispossession signified many things for the native people simultaneously and with consequences in different dimensions of or areas. In first place, territorial dispossession of the land obviously took away the possibility of survival for the family, which is the core of the collective organization, also for the group, the collective group, and of course for the civilization or people to which they belonged. Secondly, the loss of the territory meant relocation, the rearrangement of entire populations to different peoples, with the consequent loss of cultural roots. Even the groups that were nomadic, as the case addressed in this research, were left adrift from an imposed territorial delimitation. And finally, the territorial dispossession produced the colonial political domination because the original institutions and organization systems were totally or partially eliminated. So what is territory, or what is an indigenous territory since my perspective in this research. Territory has a fundamental cultural meaning for the indigenous people's survival. The territory provides resources enough for living collectively, but also is the space where the people created identities, a sense of belonging, social and kinship relations, political and power connections, a worldview, and cultural expressions. The territory is historically built, changed. It's a conjunction of space and time. The struggle for the territory is not just a demand for land property. It's, after all, since my perspective, about the ability to decide how to live collectively in a certain space, not necessarily limited by borders. That's why territory is linked to identity and self-determination and autonomy. So I'm studying how the problems of the border between Mexico and the United States, and specifically the immigration policies, are impacting in a nation who was dispossessed and divided. With that being said, let's talk about the Tohono O'odham Nation. The Tohono O'odham Nation is a native indigenous people that is binational and is in the border, and which, in addition to having suffered this territorial dispossession throughout its history, now has been exposed to the problems that are happening in one of the most controversial borders in the world. Then I'm focused on the region located in the northeast of the Mexican state of Sonora and the southwest of Arizona, where is the Tohono Nation territory, also known as Papago people in Mexico. The O'odham people comes from one of the three groups called O'odham, who were basically Akimel O'odham, the Tohono O'odham, and the third group were the said O'odham, or some people who lived in the hottest and driest part of the Sonora Desert. The O'odham were nomads, and the three groups moved from what is now Phoenix, Arizona, to Casa Grande, Sonora, according to the season of the year. Because searching water and food determined the movements of the group, we can understand the importance of the resources. Therefore, many ceremonies, dances, and rituals have the water as its center and a very close relationship with their land spaces. For example, one of the most famous and important ceremony is the pilgrimage of a salt pilgrimage, or Peregrinación de la Sal, which is a journey of more than 300 miles through the El Pinacate Reserve until the Mar de Cortés. When the Spanish arrived, the O'odham population was reduced. The diseases brought by the Europeans, the fights with the Apache, and the incursions of people outside their territory decimated the population. In addition, the O'odham resisted the attempts of the Jesuits and Franciscans to modify their form of organization based on this mobility. So at the end of the 19th century, only the Tohono O'odham remained around the Gila, Santa Cruz, and San Javier rivers. As we know, the border was a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 and the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. In the United States, the policy of reducing the indigenous population began in the 19th century, which, as we know, consisted mainly in concentrating the indigenous populations in reservations through the executive order of the President Woodrow Wilson. With the Tohono Reservation creation, the area of their land was reduced. That was left of the Tohono Oodham territory was guaranteed. We're talking about 2.8 million acres. One of the largest reservation in the United States. But in the other hand, the groups were limited to and forced to interact with each other and build a common identity. The Office on Indian Affairs established the reservation with the idea that the Papagos were a single tribe and forced them to constitute a government. For 20 years, the Oodhams opposed to that, and they tried to organize themselves until the 937, they finally accepted the Reorganization Act. A constitution was written, and it was made one and only one official identity. So the Oodham were regrouped and forced to modify the relationship patterns between the groups that previously did not have it because of the constant mobility. Actually, anthropologists have said that creating a common identity, it was more a survival strategy than a result of the development of historical processes. At the same time, the identity with the Oodham and at the Mexican side was separated. The Oodham Nation is today composed by 12 districts. 11 are in Arizona and the 12th is in Mexico. The mainly population is in the American side with 33,000 people identify as Tohono Oodham and only 3,000 in the Mexican side. Also, an office was created for manage the relationship between both countries. According to the extant purchase, the government of the United States respects the territorial rights of the Oodham as Mexican citizens and recognize Oodham of the American side the same rights as all US citizens. In Mexico, the Oodham were constantly a hassle for the Spanish and mestizos until the Mexican Revolution. But it was until the President Lázaro Cárdenas when the indigenous people in the state of Sonora received endowments of land and began to have or to live in a relative peace and stability. Some other communities were added during the 70s and 80s. However, the land with which they were endowed did not represent even 10 or 50% of the original territory of the Papago in Mexico. And moreover, so in some cases, the endowments were incorrect, causing agrarian conflicts between communities, some of them unsolved until now. The consequence of this situation was the reduction of the population. A part of the population was displaced in the Mexican side to inhospitable areas with few resources. Others decided to migrate to the United States. But an important effect to the lack of protection for Oodham is the loss of the language. Due to racism and discrimination, people hide themselves. So they decided to hide their language so as not to be discriminated against, in such a way that today, as I said, only 3,000 Oodham speakers are in Sonora. They live in small rural communities far from the cities and with a high level of poverty and without access to education, health, and housing, and with low paid salary jobs. So the Papago were not sufficiently recognized as indigenous people in Mexico and have recently they are recently fighting for their recognition as native people, and they are looking for the recognition of their territory, especially because the Mexican authorities consider them as nomadic or semi-nomadic, so they don't recognize the ancestral possession of the land. So what is happening in the border? I want to mention that in this specific region, the border was a space of immigration itself. The mining companies that settled in the area during 19th century and the companies in charge of the transcontinental train construction hired migrant labor in the border area, but also that process was always based in principles of unequal treatment and exploitment or exploitation. This practice continued on the following decades with the development of cities in the the southwestern, until the 80s, when employees in the agricultural industry, food industry, realized that they can pay less to undocumented migrants and dismiss them easily from his over-exploited work. When immigrants tried to seek job opportunities in the early 90s, the anti-immigrant practices, which had been brewing, some of them since the 1930s in some states like Arizona, became more aggressive, monitoring and patrolling other crossing points at the border. The economic deceleration of in the United States and the terrorist attack on 9/11 modifies migration policies, and the US government intensifies the construction of the wall under George Bush Jr. presidency. After that, the Obama administration ordered mass deportations. The point to crossing along the border were gradually crossing. The desert of Arizona became a funnel for the people who tried to cross through it, which has caused a human tragedy in terms of lives lost in a hostile and dangerous journey. We can see the map, and the red dots are points where these human borders are contabilized deaths in the desert. The Valley of the Altar became, since the beginning of the 20th century, the main corridor between the two countries for immigration, but also for smuggling. The Sinaloa cartel started to use desperate migrants to carry drugs or commit other crimes in exchange to pay for crossing the border. During 2000, the transit of migrants through Papago small cities, such as Altar or Cesabet, increased. Even modify the economic dynamics of those cities, which began to base their economy on service for the people in transit, like small stores or food businesses or hotels but also because the militarization in the cities and roads. As I mentioned, when the reservation was created, the US government agreed on a procedure that would allow Oodham communities in Mexico pass through the border as part of the Tohono people. Identification credentials were provided to people that prove of their membership through the language or kinship ties or birth certificates. But that was the first artificial barrier lift up into territory. The first obstacle to free transit through the territory for visits, their sacred places, family visits, recollections, etc. Gradually, immigration policies were tightening their requirements. The credential that proves belonging to the Tohono Oodham group was not enough to be able to cross the border. The immigration authorities required immigration visas or other documents for tourist trips or business purposes. Even when they have limited their transit to the reserve, sometimes the Tohono Oodham credential has been also ineffective because many people are detained and deported by the Border Patrol when they travel for their traditional lands. People who live in the reservation are also prevented by US Customs for transporting some materials and goods essentials for their economy and to practice their culture, like bird feathers, tree leaves, or sweet herbs. The Border Patrol is hyper empowered, and it is almost operate like a force of occupation because they are making frequent raids on local stores or detaining Latinx citizens profiled as immigrants crossing the border. At this point, there is only one gate to cross remained open, the San Miguel Gate in the Tohono territory. In the south of Arizona, the construction of a border fence began in 2007. And the officials in charge said that the project, the environmental impact of the project had been calculated and that will be minimal. But this contrasted with other studies by independent environmentalists who projected that the barrier would mean a cut in a natural corridor in the habitat of jaguars or other species and harm other. The environmentalists themselves did not see the construction of a wall a solution for the migrant mobility compared to the ecological damage that would it cause in the medium or long term. So before to talk more extensively about the construction of the wall, I would like to say something about the Trump's administration toward the Native American nations. During the Donald Trump administration, the confrontation with the Native nations was constant. And the main reason were the economic projects that have been intended to be carried out. For example, the authorization of the Dakota Access Pipeline was one of the first official acts as a president in January 2017. After that, the budget for the Office of Indigenous Affairs of the Department of the Interior, which carries out projects in education, health, human rights, and housing, was reduced. Trump tried to privatize the lands that are in federal trust to open the lands in possession of the Native nations to the extraction of natural resources or other projects. As is the case of the National Monument years, for which Trump signed a proclamation to reduce by 50% the territory of 2 national parks in Utah belonging to the Navajo, Ute, and Hopi nations, and with this action, rewarding the fossil fuel industry, which donated more than $1.1 million to his 2016 electoral campaign. So during the past 4 years, the immigration policy was characterized, among other things, by the stark criminalization of immigration and a racist anti-immigrant speech, the separation of families to increase the human cost of to people seeking to settle in the United States and discourage the phenomenon, and of course the extension and reinforcement of the wall. To face the Oodham protest, the government used the Real ID Act 2005, which allows the federal government to waive or abide by laws that conflict with a national security issue. Since 2019, the conflict between the Oodham representatives and the federal government escalated due to the introduction of bulldozers and controlled explosions to raise the wall, destroying numerous cactus sacred sites and particularly damage to the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, which is a park declared by the UN ESCO as a nature reserve. All this was denounced as an attack against Native American toms, endangered species, and the environment, putting at least 22 archaeological sites at risk. Additionally, building in the desert requires at least 84,000 gallons of water a day, which is concerned among the population that the water will be depleted. Just an example, what is the meaning or what is the impact of the wall? There is an image that I find very shocking and representative. This in the screen, you can see a saguaro cactus. The saguaro cactus grows only in the Sonora and Arizona desert. The Oodham use their fruits, also the flowers and seeds, as food, and also to prepare a wine used in ceremonies to ask for rain. This cactus in adulthood reach between 12 and 18 meters, but to reach a meter high, it must live 4 years. So these are plants whose lives goes back up to 200 or 300 years. So we can say that they are witnessed the history of peoples, and they are considered by the Oodham, the Tohono Oodham, as a different type of humanity. And so they are viewed as a respected members of the Tohono Oodham Nation. So we can imagine the feeling for the people to see how these saguaros are being taken off and removed or destroyed by bulldozers. In the other side of the border in Mexico, one of the actions that the Papago people are doing to try to stop the wall, the construction of the wall, is requesting to the Mexican government for an expert opinion to lead to their recognition as indigenous people and the protection of their territory, specifically El Pinacate Reserve and El Gran Desierto de Altar, which is a biosphere reserve, and which is affected for salt mine and allowed by the government. So together the Oodham communities in Sonora, in Arizona, are being organized some protests and have attracted the media attention to their demands. And they are asking for consultations from government to government, which is the figure that mandates the law and the international framework for the relationship and decision making of policies that affect the native and indigenous nations. So I would like to use the word perspectives, not the conclusions, because the political scenario is changing these few weeks. And the President Biden has ordered the halt of the construction of the wall as one of the actions aimed at compensating the damage caused by Trump policies. A new immigration policy has been announced, but we don't know the details yet. So it's hopeful, it's hopeful the fact that some outstanding personalities of the Native American nations have been hired by the Biden's administration, because it's going to be very interesting how they can put the worldview and the Native American perspective into the government. On the other hand, Mexico has an urgent and pending task to recognize the rights of origin and permanence of the Oodham Nation as our original inhabitants of the territory of the El Pinacate and del Desierto de Altar, including the area of the salt floods. Is necessary also a diagnosis of the impact of the environment and the archaeological site of the salt mines in Mexico, as well as make a free and informed consultation on whether or not to allow those economic projects. So also is urgent a binational migration policy that does not throw migrants into the hands of the drug cartels of trafficking or trafficking gangs of people who take advantage of they and lead people crossing the desert to death. Finally, I want to say that the wall, the construction of the wall, reflects the failure of one immigration policy, because it has not prevented migration and is causing an irreparable damage to the Tohono territory. I leave it from here, but if you have some questions, I will be happy to answer.